Welcome back. Excited to be here. Last time I was at this kind of setup, I've defended my dissertation, so this feels fantastic. Welcome, first panel, day 2, assessing digital media markets, new players, and policy responses. My name is David Nieborg. I'm from the University of Toronto. I have 2 requests for all the speakers, and I'm going to do it publicly so we can shame the speakers if they don't listen to me. That seems to work really well. Can you speak next to the mic? This will going to go fantastic. And can you not go over time? And if you do go over time, I'm going to stand there and wave and mute you or throw objects at you. I won't, but so that's the housekeeping. The first speaker is next to me, to my right, Anders Henten, professor at the Department of Electronic Systems at Aalborg University in the beautiful city of Copenhagen. The floor is yours.
Could we have the slide up? It's coming up. But, well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Dwayne, for... It doesn't matter, I'll start talking. I want to thank you, Dwayne, for inviting me to talk at this session here. It's a theory-oriented paper in contrast to most of the other presentations that we have had here, so I hope you will bear with me. In a sense, listening to some of the presentations here, I think that it's maybe my presentation is a bit like walking through open doors, but let's wait and see when you have heard what I have to say. I think that the topic is relevant for this conference here because it is about concentration of big tech and concentration of platforms. And it's actually a paper that I've also presented at the latest International Telecommunications Society conference in Gothenburg. It was at Chalmers University, so it must be a Chalmers presentation, this one here. And there were some, I mean, as with always with presentations of paper, there were some positive comments and also some more critical comments. And I like to mention the critical comments so that you can maybe think about it while I'm speaking here. I mean, the first one was because this is about demand side economies of scope. And there was some discussion as to what's the value of looking at it from the demand side, because scope economies is to a large extent from the supply side, but what's the value of it, including the demand side in this issue also. And the other topic was, because I have the claim here that scope has not gone much into analysis of platforms in the academic literature, right? And my claim is that regulation today, for instance, the DMA in Europe, is a lot about scope. At least the initiatives is about doing something with the scoping of these companies, while most academic analyses are about scale, actually. Next slide, please. So, as it says here, until now, focus in the academic analysis has mostly been on the demand side of economies of scale caused by network effects, and also on the lowering of transaction cost in multi-sided platforms, and then data, including data on users. And I think that these different elements explain very well the growth and strength of individual business areas of the big tech corporations, but they don't really explain the scope of activities. And I think, therefore, that we need also to look at the scope, and I can hear from many of the presentations here at this conference that this is also a topic that we are looking very much at. Next slide, please. So we know that these corporations, they have sort of branched into a multitude of different business areas. I just mentioned 2 of them. Amazon acquires MGM, and Apple in healthcare and so on. There are hundreds of examples of this. However, focus in most academic literature has actually been on scale. And I think that it also applies generally, that one could say that scope generally has been an orphan compared with scale in most analysis. And this is where I find that there is a mismatch between the actual political and regulatory initiatives, because if you look at the DMA, it is to a very large extent about hindering scope, or at least dealing with scope of these corporations, while the academic analysis to a very large extent deal with scale and have not really looked at the scope issue, in my opinion. But this we can maybe debate afterwards. So when in network effects have turned, next slide please. Yeah, thank you, I need to say next slide please. Network effects have turned, in a sense, scale economies upside down, in the sense that it looks at the demand side in networked industries to very large. And the intention of this paper was then, could we do something of the same character with respect to scope, or is there any idea in this? And I obviously think that there is, otherwise I wouldn't be making the presentation. And there are specifically two areas that I'm looking at here. It's bundling and user data. Next slide, please. So the research question that I'm dealing with here, it deals with the strength and growth of big tech corporations. And the research question then, it could be, how do economies of scope driven by the demand side contribute to strength of successful big tech corporations? Next slide, please. And the structure of the paper is rather traditional. There's a methodology, theory, tech cases that I will come back to, and the analysis and conclusion. And the purpose of the paper is basically to attract attention to the scope aspects, and more specifically the demand side aspects of scope in the analysis, and thus maybe to contribute to the theory and knowledge about how these corporations work. Next slide, please. So in the theory section, I go back sort of to the traditional theory on scope with Panzer and Willig and Thies, and as it says here, Panzer and Willig, they first looked on concentrated their view on production facilities. Thies included transaction cost perspectives, and then just a little after, Panzer and Willig wrote a paper which is still, in a sense, state-of-the-art in the area, looking at both the production facilities but also transaction cost aspects. Next slide, please. When we then turn to sort of the demand side of it, because these theories that I mentioned have basically looked at it from the supply side. If we look at it from the demand side, very little has actually taken up that topic. Maybe because it's stupid, or maybe because, we can discuss that, but very little literature is on this field. Milton Müller, in a paper for a conference, dealt with the issue that in this paper he called it subject side economics. And he also deals with it actually in his famous book on universal service from 1997. But his idea was basically, when if we look at a traditional network, and when there is a new user coming to this network, then the claim is that this is a new service, right? And therefore he calls it scope also. He calls it demand-side economies of scope. But this is what we normally call demand-side economies of scale, isn't it? So not much has actually been done in this connection. Next slide, please. I have also, some more than 10 years ago, written on the subject. It was about triple and quadruple play. And one could say the topic was basically bundling, right? And one could say that this paper that we wrote, I wrote it together with a Norwegian, Helge, and it didn't get much attention actually. And now, since we are trying again, because I see that this is very important for the importance of these big tech corporations. It's not only the scale operations they have, but also to a very large extent the scope that they have, and that there is a demand side aspect of that too. Next slide, please. So of course it's important to see that the demand side and supply side, they are sort of interconnected. There's a virtuous cycle between demand side and supply side, and it also applies to network effects. And the two issues here that I want to look at is basically bundling, one-stop shopping, lowering search costs, enhanced complementarity between related products, and therefore also convenience for users. And then the other aspect, which is user data. And as you will know, knowledge about users has always been very important for all kinds of businesses. But what has happened is, and this has also been touched upon in this meeting several times, is that knowledge on users has become an intrinsic part of the value proposition of many companies. So it has sort of also developed. And these are the two aspects that we have been looking at in this paper. Next slide, please. And the cases that we analyze are those that we normally call GAFAM, but because of name changes, we here call them MAM. So because they have changed their names. And the focus is on scope and the complementarities between the different services and products that they deliver. And here in the next slide, there will be an emphasis on acquisitions and R&D. I mean, we have in the paper analyzed, not deeply, but we have looked into each of these MAM companies and analyzed sort of the scoping aspects of their operations. You will probably not be able to read this slide here, but I can tell you what it says. I mean, where we have the years at the bottom of it, there are the number of acquisitions, and the number of acquisitions have been touched upon several times in other presentations here. And one couldn't say that it's going up, or I mean, for each of these different corporations, it's very much on the same level. Now, some years, many acquisitions, other years, fewer acquisitions, but these are huge numbers. I mean, for Microsoft, since 94, it's 226, Apple, 123, and so on and so forth. So many acquisitions. But maybe, I wouldn't say the surprising thing, but you will know that in some papers you can read that once companies become very big and start acquisitions of other companies in order to sort of build their businesses, they stop their own, not stop, but they lower their own investments in R&D. This is absolutely not the case for these companies. I mean, if you could see the figures, and you cannot see, next slide please, yes? This is the one, okay. You would be able to see, if you could see, that there's been a huge increase in R&D investments for these companies. So they don't only acquire and merge with other companies, they also have huge R&D investments themselves. Next slide, please. So in the analysis, one could say that there are many similarities, and Valetti also touched upon, I think, that one of the intentions in his presentation was to say that we are dealing with companies that have many similarities, and I do agree with that. But there are, of course, also differences between these different companies, and their focus is slightly different, and there are also differences. For instance, Apple is more focused in their activities than Amazon, in our opinion. There's the issue of whether the scope is primarily horizontal or vertical. There's also the centrality of multi-sided platforms. There are many different aspects which are different for these companies, even though they have many similarities. Next slide, please. And some of these differences and similarities have to do with whether they are more or less focused or diversified, whether their scope is basically horizontal or vertical, or the sort of the weight of horizontal and vertical integration, the scale and or the scope, how much emphasis is there on scale and scope, and whether the platforms are transaction or innovation platforms, the centrality of multi-sided platforms, how it is with bundling and the use of user data, and how it is with mergers and acquisitions and indoor development. So there are many different aspects which of course differ for these companies, but there are, and I do agree with that, many similarities with respect to these companies. Next slide, please. So an important issue here is in the sense that asset specificity regarding facilities and competences is relatively low in the IT area compared to many other areas, and they become sort of general purpose technologies, and therefore there are good possibilities for scope in these companies. Whether that leads to whether this kind of asset specificity leads to insourcing or outsourcing of activities is, in my opinion, a case of concrete analysis. One cannot say that in advance whether they will insource or outsource different kinds of activities, because that also depends on market power and appropriation of value added and so on and so forth. In a very good paper lately from 21, Annabelle Gaver, she analyzes the boundaries of companies. And this is somewhat similar to what we are doing here. We are more interested in the internal scope of companies, and she's more interested in the boundaries. But it is, yes, it is to a very large extent the same issue that we are dealing with. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, is basically the aim of the paper is to attract attention to the scope aspects of companies, and including here the demand side economies of scope aspects. And I think that the empirical evidence that we have in the paper somehow documents, of course one needs much more documentation here, but sort of documents that scope is important and also the demand side aspects of it. So one could ask the question, is it the same issue with demand-side economies of scale and demand-side economies of scope? And here you could say that I write no. I mean, there are absolutely differences. Network effects, in a sense, lead to winner-take-all markets, while bundling works for the individual user. So it's not sort of between the users, it's for the individual user. And one could say that demand-side economies of scale work, in a sense, independently based on the interaction between users, while when we talk about scope, it requires interaction between the demand side and the supply side. And I tried to illustrate that with a small hand drawing here so that you could avoid looking at my qualities with digital drawing. So this small picture basically say we have a supply and we have a demand side, right? And if you look at the next slide, please, sorry. Yes, this one. We have a demand and a supply side, and we look at network effects which lead to demand side economies of scale. So it's clearly on the demand side. If we look at demand side economies of scope, bundling and user data, it sort of requires an interaction, a larger degree of interaction between the demand and the supply side. So that sort of summarizes what I wanted to say about this topic here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. What a better way to start the day two with a solid theoretical basis. The next speakers are in Australia. It's 11 p.m., so thanks for staying with us. Professor Terry Flew, University of Sydney, Professor of Digital Communication and Culture, and his colleague Cameron McTernan. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Dwayne and the team for bringing this venture together and for organising this fantastic event. Our apologies for not being there. It is, in terms of time of semester, a difficult time to leave a Southern Hemisphere university right at the moment, but we're very much enjoying being a part of this pioneering conference. We will do this presentation in two parts. I'll undertake the first part and my colleague Cameron McTernan will undertake the second. Before I begin, and next slide. As is customary, at least in Australia, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditions of custodianship and law of the countries on which the University of Sydney campuses stand and the countries on which we are both currently on, and pay respects to elders past, present, who have cared and continue to care for country. Next slide. What we're going to be talking about today is a discussion paper circulated by the Australian Communication and Media Authority, a research paper outlining a new framework for measuring news media diversity and localism in Australia. And we think that this paper is important because it introduces, at least in the Australian context, some different ways of thinking about questions of media ownership and competition, that rather than an aggregate national snapshot, it poses the question of what are we seeing at the more granular and local level, and what do we see in terms of diversity of sources, news sources that are available to consumers. So there's a distinctive geographical lens to this, and a distinctive consumer orientation to it. Next slide. Okay, in terms of the overarching regulatory framework that the ACMA in Australia works with, and it would be reasonable, I believe, to describe the ACMA's approach to regulation as being very much within the responsive regulation tradition, that it looks to explicitly position itself as a co-regulatory agency with a preference for industry self-regulation at lower levels and its interventions coming in at the more macro level. It articulated in the mid-2010s a series of what it referred to as enduring concepts that underpin the evolution of its regulatory framework. And these are framed around questions of market standards, questions of social and economic participation, cultural values, and safeguards. What we'll be discussing today broadly sits within the realm of cultural values, although, as you'll see, it also relates to questions of market standards and competition. Next slide. Okay, the industry context, for anyone who knows anything about the Australian commercial media scene, you would be aware that Australian print and broadcast media are highly concentrated by international standards, and from the 2016 Who Owns the World's Media collection, edited by Ellie Noam, Franco Papandreou and Rod Tiffin, who undertook the Australian study, identified the concentration ratio for the 4 leading newspaper publishers in Australia as an astonishing 99.4%. So just about every capital city newspaper in Australia is owned by one of 4 companies. In television, the concentration ratio is 77.2%. This means that, as Papandreou and Tiffin put it, 4 key corporations historically dominated Australian newspapers, magazines, television and radio, and had various other interests. Of these, the most famous and controversial is Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. And Papandreou and Tiffin add that the mix of concentrated ownership and powerful personalities has meant that media policy has sometimes been a contentious issue in Australia. I think the only qualifier I'd want to put to their statement there is the use of the word sometimes. I think it's fair to say it's always been a highly politicised issue in Australia. Next slide. Okay, the policy context is that media reforms in the 1980s, undertaken by the Hawke Labor government, enabled greater concentration within media markets. In particular, they enabled the development of a national broadcasting market, which had been restricted prior to then, while at the same time strengthening cross-media ownership laws. As the then Treasurer Paul Keating referred to it, media moguls could be princes of print or queens of the screen, but could not be both. By the 2010s, traditional media owners across all of these platforms were demanding a watering down of these cross-media rules. The premise on which they were seeking this was the growing competition for advertising that they were facing from the digital platforms such as Google and Facebook, as well as competition for market share in the case of broadcasting from streaming services such as Netflix. So the then Turnbull Liberal National Party government in 2017 introduced the Broadcasting Legislation Amendment Media Reform Bill that aimed to reduce cross-media ownership restrictions so as it saw it to better enable traditional media to compete with digital platforms. And this involved the removal of what was known as the 75% audience reach rule and the 2 out of 3 cross-media ownership rule. And following the introduction of this media reform package, the Australian media industry experienced significant structural change, including the merger in 2018 of the largest television company in Australia, Nine Entertainment, with one of the 2 largest newspaper companies, Fairfax Media. The quid pro quos that enabled this legislation to pass and to get support from independents and minor parties were an investigation into the power of digital platforms that would be the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission Digital Platforms Inquiry. Next slide. Okay, so we speak about a crisis of Australian news journalism, and aspects of this will sound similar to what's been experienced in other countries. And I would say there's a quite excellent website, the Australian Newsroom Mapping Project, that provides you with the underpinning data on this with a great degree of granularity. So a Senate inquiry into the future of public interest journalism identified that 25% of journalism positions in Australia were lost in the period from 2012 to 2017. That decline has continued, and the COVID period saw the closure of 100 plus newspapers, mainly local newspapers and regional newspapers that were part of the News Limited group. Now, the map that you can see identifies this, but it also identifies a counter trend. And I think if we were simply talking about the decline, the disappearance of newspaper titles, we would have a story that's familiar and actually not that hard to narrate. But we also have the emergence of a variety of new, particularly online providers. So if you can see on this slide, if you look at the red there, that identifies the number of news titles that disappeared over the last 5 years, but the green identifies new titles that have emerged. So we have a couple of things going on that counterbalance possibly the story of terminal decline in Australian news media. The first is that the News Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code, which a number of you would be familiar with, particularly in light of Facebook's withdrawal of its news feed from Australia for an 11-day period in 2012. In 2011, I should say, has seen a significant amount of money, although no one actually knows how much money, going from Google and Facebook to traditional media companies in Australia. Now, a number of companies have been excluded from that funding, particularly by Facebook, but there is some evidence that journalism jobs have been created in traditional news media companies based upon that flow of funds from digital platforms. At the same time, there's also been the emergence of a variety of online local news platforms that have been, in some respects, filling the gap left by the disappearance of traditional titles, or they're moving to subscription models. So an example would be an online site called Riot Act, ACT being here ACT being the Australian Capital Territory, which now claims to attract a readership of the size of the traditional provider to that, to Canberra, the Canberra Times. And these publications are drawing significant advertising revenue. They're operating on much lower journalist bases, but they are attracting advertising revenue, including the all-important real estate and classifieds. Other sources of funding for public interest journalism have been emerging, including philanthropy. A variety of foundations have been investing in journalism, such as the Judith Neilson Institute. And there's also been a certain amount of government funding available through what is known as PING, the Public Interest News Gathering Initiative, that has gone through two tranches of putting $50 to $60 million available. The first rather contentiously ruling out foreign-owned news outlets from receiving the funding, which was perceived to be a political slight directed towards the Guardian Australia, to which some may say, well, if we're talking about foreign-owned news companies, may News Corporation turn up on the agenda here, given that last we checked, it was registered in the state of Delaware, but that was not to be. The second tranche of 60 million did not apply that condition to it. And at this point, I'll hand over to Cameron.
Thank you, Terry. At the same time as this, we see a reconfiguration of the advertising market brought on by tech giants Google and Facebook that has reportedly increased the total marketing spend on advertising, but has also consumed much of the market segment once held by print. In 2019, the Australia Consumer Watchdog, the ACCC, concluded their digital platforms inquiry, revealing the massive impact that these US companies have had on Australian news producers. This was shortly followed by a legislative intervention, the News Media Bargaining Code, which Terry mentioned before, which was introduced to help support sustainability of public interest journalism in Australia by giving news producers stronger bargaining power with the tech giants over their share of advertising revenue. We can see here from these slides the very rapid decline of print media's advertising revenue share, and then the rise of online here. At the same time, there's actually been a groundswell of public concern for media diversity in Australia. A 2021 Senate inquiry into media diversity in Australia received 5,054 submissions ranging from academics and research groups, media organisations, non-profits, members of the public, and most notably, 2 former Prime Ministers, including Kevin Rudd, who we see here. Findings from the Senate's final report suggest that Australia's current regulatory framework is not fit for purpose, and that there are significant issues regarding the concentration of media ownership, as well as concerns for the spread of misinformation and the need to preserve public broadcasters. So what we see here is while the nation's media ownership laws have been diluted, concentration has increased, the struggle for advertising revenue has become a legislative issue, and members of the public sphere are calling for action to address the state of news diversity in Australia. At this time, arriving in a moment of uncertainty and change for the Australian media industry comes the ACMA's news measurement framework, which is a proposed framework for monitoring Australian news. The ACMA is the statutory authority responsible for regulating Australian communications and media with the remit to maximise economic and social benefits of communications infrastructure, services and content for Australia. It also operates in tandem with the previously mentioned statutory body, the ACCC, to monitor and regulate Australia's media and communications industry. The ACMA's remit is broad and is tasked with regulating both licensing and content, while by comparison, the ACCC has the narrower responsibility of regulating market competition and protecting the interests and safety of consumers of a range of industries, including the media. The ACMA's proposed news media measurement framework is, in their words, an alternative framework to measure the current levels of news diversity and the availability of local news throughout Australia, and as a response to an ever more complex and shifting media landscape brought on by the digital revolution. As we can see here, the news measurement framework proposes 3 main categories of measurement, and these draw upon Napoli's 1999 framework of measuring diversity at multiple stages of the media supply chain. The first is news infrastructure, which includes recording the availability of services, of sources, journalists, and the number of actual media owners. The second is news output, where they intend to measure the range of topics, the range of viewpoints, and local relevance. And the third is news engagement, where they intend to record consumption and impact. Australia isn't the only nation or region adapting an existing framework for measuring diversity at this time. Alternative examples of media pluralism and diversity frameworks abroad include the EU Media Pluralism Monitor, the UK's Ofcom measurement framework for media plurality, and the Republic of Korea's Uses and Influences of News Media framework. Of these frameworks, the ACMA's appears closer in design to the UK's framework than that of the EU or South Korea. Both the ACMA's proposal and Ofcom's framework attempt to account for source diversity by recording the number of news sources available to the consumer. Indeed, the ACMA framework goes a step further to identify not only the publications, but also the availability of journalists and ownership. The ACMA's framework also differs from that of Ofcom by providing a greater emphasis on content and localism, which is absent from the UK model. Whereas the Ofcom framework places a greater emphasis on news consumption, specifically share of consumption, multi-sourcing and reach. This difference makes good sense for an Australian context. It shows a tailoring of the ACMA's framework to Australia's local conditions, specifically the metro-rural divide and geographic expanse of the nation, which amplifies the need for localised news. The ACMA's proposal makes a compelling case for expanding its monitoring practice, recognising, as we have, there has been a structural transformation within the industry and that new measures of diversity need to account for cross-platform content ownership and the digital sphere with a view to better informing regulators and policymakers. But the framework appears to have actually been put on ice for now and may never be operationalised. At the time of the framework's publication in 2020, the ACMA stated that it was being made for public review, but not progressed due to a diversion of resources responding to the global pandemic. With the pandemic still ongoing and a change in government, the future for the proposed framework is uncertain. At the same time, it provides insight into the ACMA's current thinking on media diversity and localism in Australia and helps to highlight issues that the regulator hopes to respond to. At this point, we too have a number of questions relating to media diversity in Australia, of which we hope to answer in due course. The first is regarding the outcomes of the News Media Bargaining Code. Scholars have raised concerns as to whether the code will help fund public interest journalism or be directed elsewhere by media companies that have benefited from it, and whether it will be a result in further dependency and entrenchment of the current dynamic between traditional news companies and those tech giants. We also want to consider further understanding the flow of audience and content across platforms old and new. In an age of tech giants, researchers now have access to an enormous amount of behavioural data regarding media consumption online. Meta's CrowdTangle platform has been used by digital media scholars for some time now, but recently Twitter and YouTube have opened up developer access to researchers also. These platforms afford researchers unprecedented access to platform APIs, which in turn can be used to generate large data sets about page posts and videos, as well as public-facing metadata, such as likes, shares, and view count. This could be a useful tool for measuring diversity at multiple stages of the news supply chain. Schlossberg and Friedman identify the need for regulators to account for this kind of data in their regulatory decisions, noting at the time of the 2018 merger proposal in the UK between 21st Century Fox and Sky, Ofcom's then current modelling didn't adequately account for the cross-platform reach of news sources on digital platforms. The modelling treated intermediaries such as Facebook as a single source, significantly understating the plurality of the actual news diet. We say by cross-referencing news pages with data available from the Public Interest Journalism Initiative's database, we can begin to identify the dominance of publications and their owners. Who has the most pages, the most content, and the most followers? User metrics might help us to gauge the salience and interest of news consumers on these platforms. Manovich suggests that capturing records of human behaviour with technology is often helpful not only because of the possible scale of the observations, but also because we can capture dimensions of experiences that participants may not be able to report verbally or evaluate correctly. These large data sets also provide much more than user engagement metrics. We might too be able to identify patterns of syndication and how Australia's news media companies are generally adapting to social media platforms. Finally, we wish to identify the availability of localised news and public interest journalism as it relates to these social media companies. We can assume that the potential reach of news is increased by these companies' platforms, but is it a net positive or is the audience shifting and/or shrinking? Our project plans to observe news infrastructure, news output, and news age engagement, as Napoli would put it, on Facebook, and possibly Twitter and YouTube too. with a view to understanding the state of news media diversity online and to test the viability of digital methods to achieve this. There is a potential here to map the cross-platform reach of these news producers, accounting for territory and consumption in a hybridized media environment. The social metrics afforded by these platforms offer a different understanding of news engagement than the qualitative surveys suggested by the ACMA and currently used by Ofcom. Large data sets can provide us with broad scope understanding of news content on social media platforms, such as Facebook. Insights might help us understand the effect that these tech platforms have had on Australia's news content and consumption. So how does this fit into the broader GMICP project and the issues currently facing media diversity in Australia? We say that diversity and pluralism have many indicators, and there are a number of competing frameworks beyond that theorised by Napoli. The ACMA has proposed measuring some of these, such as content diversity and localism, and the GMICP is measuring others such as revenue, share, and subscribers. Our project will take a closer look at the digital realm and observe aspects of Australia's hybridised media system with a better view to understanding the power of these platforms have had in shaping Australia's media industry. Thank you.
Thank you. The third speaker, I feel like we're flying from Australia to Mexico, is Dr. Argelia Muñoz, a postdoctoral researcher at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana-Cuajimalpa, and with her colleague, Professor Rodrigo Gómez. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. Can you hear me well and can you see the presentation? Okay. Please let me know if there's any issue looking at the slides. Okay, so I'm gonna talk to you about streaming video platforms in Mexico. I'm gonna focus on the concentration in terms of the ownership of the companies, their country of origin, and the market shares. I have to say that this, we're not presenting any results of any concluded research. On the contrary, I think it's more like the starting point of future research if I had the opportunity to do a second year of the postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Rodrigo Gómez. So I'm gonna start by giving you some context about the audiovisual industry in Mexico. What I would like you to pay attention here is the names of the companies that have the biggest market shares here in the pie charts. So in terms of free-to-air television, in Mexico, we've had for decades a duopoly between these two companies, Televisa and TV Azteca, that together concentrate almost 90% of the audience share and a fair bit also of the advertising revenue share. And in terms of paid television, we also have a duopoly, again with Televisa being a dominant player. Now, if we take a look at the subsector of cinema distribution, we'll find the major Hollywood companies having also a stronghold with more than 80% of the market in terms of revenue share. And if we take a look at the traditional window of cinema exhibition, we also have a duopoly. In this case, it's two Mexican companies that together dominate more than 90% of the revenue share. So one of the consequences of having this arrangement in the distribution at cinemas has some, as I said, some consequences. For instance, that films that are watched at cinemas in Mexico are mainly films from the US, and 85%, whereas Mexican films have a very low market share, as well as films from other regions from other regions of the globe, right? And I would like also to include the telecommunication sectors, because we're going to return to those when we talk about streaming. And again, I wanted to see here how, for instance, in the case of telephone, either landline or mobile, we also have these oligopolies. Rodrigo talked to you yesterday about America Mobile, for instance, and Televisa as well, which comes from the audiovisual sector, especially the TV broadcasting, and that now has also an interest in telecommunications. So as you can see, we also have these patterns of concentration in these companies having an important role. And very similar to internet access, either through a fixed line or through mobile. So now let's move on to streaming. So we've been compiling this list of the streaming platforms that operate in Mexico since 2019, more or less. And we've been updating this directory, and we've been doing it because there's no other like government agency or state agency that it's compiling such list. And well, the platforms need to have some characteristics in order to be included in this directory. Well, first of all, they have to be in Spanish, either audio or subtitles. They also need to be providing content that has been professionally produced, such as films or TV programs. They also need to be available through websites, applications, or multi-platforms. And so if they fit those characteristics, they're there in the directory. And for this year, the total number of platforms are 111. And from these, 55 are major platforms, that is, they're owned by a big corporation. 37 are independent platforms. That means that there's no link at all with any big corporation. And there are also 19 public platforms, which means they're funded by a Spanish-speaking state, that because of the language, they're easy to be consumed in Mexico. So I'm going to focus on these 55 major platforms. And one of the ways that we can start seeing the concentration is to realize that they're owned only by 28 big corporations, which are here in this map. And as you can see, they are the corporations that come from the traditional audiovisual subsectors and the telecommunications sector. So I hope you can start recognizing some of the names of the companies that we saw in the first slides. And so you can also see their platforms and their business models. For instance, if they're subscription, advertising, or transaction-based. Also, if they are TV everywhere, which means that basically you have to be subscribed to a pay TV package in order to have access to those platforms. And there's also other platforms that you won't be able to find as a standalone business, but you will need to subscribe to a multi-platform, for instance, Amazon Prime Video, to be able to then subscribe to those platforms. And so in this graph, we can see clearly, or more clearly, the country of origin of such platforms. So what we have here is that 33 platforms are owned by US companies. 8 platforms are owned by Mexican companies, which is more or less like a fourth of what US companies own. And we also have the presence of Spain, China, India, South Korea, and these kind of mixed ventures between the US and Mexican companies, the US and a Canadian company, and the US and a Japanese company. This would be the case of Sony, which is a Japanese capital, but is located or established in the US and functions as a US company. And this is the same data, but shown in different ways. So this is in terms of percentages. So what we will have here is that 60% of the major companies available in Mexico are from the US. And in this bar chart, what we're trying to visualize is that even though cinema, major studios, free-to-air television, and pay TV used to be traditionally the subsectors that will specialize in producing content, now we have, and of course they have the platforms now, which is these bars, like the amount of platforms they have in Mexico. Now we have also how the platform that belongs to a cinema chain company, it's also recently started to produce original content, the same as some of the tech companies from the US, which, by the way, I didn't mention that, but we need to include in that map those tech companies that were pioneers in streaming in the US, right? And we have also the telecommunication companies also starting to produce original content. So this is just like an indicator of their efforts to vertically integrate, and also as a sign of their concentration. And in this graph, we're showing the market share in terms of subscription to subscription video on demand platforms. I have to say that it's very difficult to get this data, but fortunately, this consulting company in Mexico has been publishing that data almost every year. And so now we can see the historical development. And as you can see here, Netflix is the dominant player. And we also can see that it's been declining a bit, the same way that, for instance, these two lines that represent the national platforms, which is Claro Video from América Móvil and Blim from Televisa, they're also declining at the same time that the Hollywood major studio platforms such as HBO Max and Disney Plus have entered the market, but they're still very far away from Netflix. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the same data for transaction or advertising models. But I think we can start thinking about how that concentration in terms of the ownership and in terms of the revenue shares have an influence on cultural diversity. And this study I did a couple of years ago about the catalog composition of the subscription video on demand platforms that were available and that were at the top 10. We can see, for instance, that Mexican titles are very few in the catalog composition compared to the US titles. And obviously because most of these companies are from the US, right? So it does have an effect. And so I wouldn't like to end the presentation with a pessimistic note. This year I was studying independent streaming platforms. And the previous year I also studied public streaming platforms. And it was a very nice surprise to find that there's actually quite a wide palette of platforms from many countries, especially Latin America because of the language. But there's also, for instance, Europe, represented by Spain, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and also from Asia, like Hong Kong and Singapore. We have also the presence of the UK and of course, again, the US with independent platforms, which usually tend to provide independent content as well. So this was a very nice surprise. The same thing with public platforms. But the bad news is that these platforms are not known by people, so they're not being consumed and their market shares will be null or very low, right? But at least I think it's an area of opportunity for the future. So final observations. I think that streaming in Mexico is like the oligopoly of the oligopolies. And I know it sounds absurd and that we have heard that this was going to happen with the convergence process. But at the same time, it's still, to me, shocking to find that in one subsector, now it's getting all those big companies from the traditional oligopolies coming together to have interest in that market, right? And so also the question is how that high concentration is influencing or affecting competition in general for other companies as well, and for consumers, for instance, for small and medium-sized platforms and for cultural diversity. And as I said, it's great that there are alternative platforms, such as independent and public, which have increased the supply diversity, but they have not been able to do the same in terms of consumption diversity. And that's where I think regulation can have an important role. I think it's urgent that the Mexican state builds a system where they can authorize the companies that operate here, not so much to put more barriers to entry or to elevate costs, but to oblige them to, for instance, provide data, not commercially sensitive, of course, but data in terms of viewership, consumption, in terms of subscriber base, so that the academia and the authorities and the regulation authorities can diagnose that subsector and see if it's convenient to establish any other type of intervention in terms of regulation. So further steps for this research will be to establish synergies with the Global Media Internet Concentration Project, because it's looking at revenue and subscriber shares, market shares and figures. And with that, if we can get that information for transaction and advertising platforms, or even independent or public platforms, to be able to compare, that would be great, as well as to be able to generate concentration indexes. And finally, to go into more detail into the debates of international regulation of streaming, and if it's convenient to discuss that in Mexico. I'll leave it here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Fantastic. Already see a lot of red threads emerging here. Fourth speaker, we're going to go back to Australia, is Associate Professor Adrian Athique, School of Communication and Arts at the University of Queensland. Adrian.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. Do you have my slides there?
Yeah, they will be teed up for you.
I'll just get started, mindful of time.
Perfect.
Yeah. In this paper, I'm going to consider the ways in which India's leading corporate appears to adopt the strategic role of the North American Megacorp, but without adopting its institutional form. And by Alfred Eichner's founding account, a Megacorp, of course, is a firm characterized by its sheer size within the industrial sector that it dominates and its prominence in the corresponding money markets. And certainly the reigning big tech firms appear to demonstrate a strategic correspondence towards Eichner's extension of the basic model, where the hegemony of a megacorp in one sector provides the institutional and capital heft to establish hegemony in other sectors, thereby expanding beyond one industry into a sprawling conglomerate firm. And this is where the demerits of market monopoly in any one sector pale in comparison to the power of oligopoly across multiple sectors. New slide, please. So in this paper, we direct our attention to the stratification of platform power across the level of capital interests, the digital megacorp, the operational combine of technology and business model, that is the super platform, and the sensory enclosure of the retail marketplace as the super app. And situating this discussion in the Indian context, our case study of a digital megacorp is Reliance Industries Limited, its Geo Platforms subsidiary, and the multi-sided offerings of Geo apps. And this strategic design has to be understood also as part of the flagship Digital India program, where the current government of India has fostered key partnerships, both with the Silicon Valley giants and with domestic business houses. And this technocratic vision of reorganizing India itself in the guise of a super platform relies upon the universal biometric ID architecture of the foundational Aadhaar platform and a series of public-private partnerships. And by far the most significant of the latter is Reliance Industries, which has been quickly positioned as the critical player in the provision of national 5G networks and hailed as India's very own national champion. And it makes perfect sense, therefore, that the government of India would turn to Reliance as the largest of India's diversified conglomerates. Reliance has extensive capabilities reaching across oil, power, telecoms, finance, retail, media, and defense. And Mukesh Ambani, the owner and CEO of Reliance, has in turn firmly endorsed state policies for rapidly expanding digital infrastructure and for localizing data, as you can see on this slide. And this outlook explicates Reliance's preceding $42 billion investment in the underlying infrastructure of a data economy through Geo Fiber, and its bundling of Geo as a super platform encapsulating news, video, music, retail, and payments. Still, it is significant that as a firm, Reliance has very little in common with the technology companies that dominate the global digital economy. The core competencies of Reliance are not in information technology hardware or software, as per Apple or Microsoft. It is not an e-commerce business in the mold of Amazon or Alibaba, nor has it ever been a data-driven business along the lines of Google or Facebook. But rather, Reliance is the largest exemplar of India's handful of elite business houses, which are essentially outsized family firms operating across multiple business sectors, occupying an all-India presence and enjoying a close working relationship with the central government. So perhaps a dozen of these operators controlling something like $1.3 trillion of capital. Next slide, please. So Reliance has also, in the course of a decade or so, become by far the largest traditional media company in India. It has done so principally through acquisitions in support of its other businesses. And in this sense, the dynamics of the media economy remain an important antecedent for the multi-sided markets of the platform economy. And the media economy as a gestalt is a relatively new analytical proposition emerging from the recognition that erstwhile media industries, sectors and functions have effectively converged through privatization, remediation and aggregation by conglomerates. And the integration of India's media industries was driven not so much by cultural, technological or commercial innovation as by the disparities of scale between actors at different levels of the market. And we can usefully shorthand the market levels of the media economy as retail marketplaces, markets of operation, and markets for interests. So rather than the general notion of sectoral markets, this schema denotes an overarching market hierarchy consisting of, first of all, the micrological level at which retail operates through venues, consumers, workers, and retailers in those spaces. The mesological level where media institutions operate, comprising of firms, their suppliers, regulatory bodies, industry labor associations. And finally, the macrological level at which media assets are acquired and organized by apex interests, comprising of holding companies, capital investors, financial entities, and the government, which is also a significant actor at this market layer. So Reliance's corporatization, so-called, of India's media economy via acquisitions in film, telecoms, broadcasting and music provides a useful example of how a conglomerate megacorp can envelop a raft of legacy and emergent media businesses in order to control adjacent markets. And the consequence of these capabilities is that Reliance has been able to determine its own status as a dominant player in all formats, in all regions, and across all strata of India's media markets. New slide, please. So how does this stratified dynamic then correspond with the sedimentary layers of the far larger digital economy enabled by media technologies and business models? And so to answer this question, we need to think, of course, of the internet stack as being simultaneously a stack of technologies and a stack of markets. In the Western historiography, it's been the commercial potentials of the internet that have been paramount to each extension of its architecture, with each additional layer of functionality adding new avenues for monetization. In the 1990s, of course, the internet was understood primarily as a communication apparatus where profits were extracted through sales of hardware, software subscription, ISP charges, and other forms of access rents. And as bandwidth increased, media formats were compressed, online payment and logistics systems were instituted, and the distribution market layer was built on the communications infrastructure, where value comes from subscriptions, from pay-per-view offerings, from e-commerce, and the bulk of the world's advertising clients. Over the past decade, the main action has been the development of a transactional layer. And so this is a higher market strata where profits are taken from the proprietary control of automated markets through various fintech apps and through the extraction and manipulation of user data. New slide, please. So crucially, the meaningful expansion of the internet in Asia has been driven by access to mobile technologies, which necessarily converges the territorial, rent-seeking logics of telecoms with the proprietary logics of software and hardware providers. And when you complete the triptych with the consumer lure of media content, whose populist logics are driven more by market share than profitability, you have an overriding strategic imperative for market dominance and for anti-competitive behavior. In most Asian markets, there are few significant regulations preventing oligopolistic behavior amongst infrastructure providers, nor are there specific barriers to establishing such positions across all layers of the local internet. And thus, in India, each layer of the digital economy is oligopolistic, with the dominant actors currently a mix of US and Indian firms. And their cohabitation reflects the fact that India's oligarchs are closely networked with their Western counterparts, which allows them to broker domestic market access, technology transfers, and access to government. And this is the context in which Reliance's fresh partnerships with Facebook, Google, and Microsoft constitute commercial partnerships as well as diplomatic transactions. And Reliance is distinguished within India's general field of oligopoly precisely because it is one of the three actors that matter in all strategic sectors and at multiple market layers. New slide, please. So any question about whether or not Reliance can be categorized as a megacorp under Eichner's definition is certainly not about doubting its mega size, market power, or conglomeration, but it has to be about the prerequisite separation between ownership and management in that theory, which would likely disqualify Reliance as a genuine corporation in any sense. Notwithstanding the recent headline investments from Facebook and Google, Mukesh Ambani personally holds a 67% stake in Jio Platforms and retains personal control of all the Reliance businesses. So our conclusion then is that the separation of ownership and management is not fundamental to the status, function, or strategy of a conglomerate oligopoly. And rather, following Braudel, the digital megacorp can be seen as an inevitable consequence of market hierarchies in the digital stack. And the key institutional factor then is the license of the state. Thus, while recognizing that megacorps in various forms are the necessary corollaries to super platforms and super apps, it may also be worth marking the differences between digital oligopolies oriented towards capturing domestic market and those geared towards extraterritorial markets. And the latter, mostly Japanese, South Korean, and American companies, compete in a global market. But the former, both Chinese and Indian, remain strategically reliant on state licensing or tacit support, and what Everett Rogers might have called the diffusion of imitations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adrian. If I'm not mistaken, this paper will be out shortly in Media, Culture and Society. I cannot wait to read it. The last speaker of this session, Dr. Guy Hoskins, needs no introduction. He's very responsible for making everything run so smoothly. Thank you. You're 1 second ahead of me. The floor is yours, Guy.
Okay, thank you, David, for that warm introduction, and good morning, everyone. So, the platform formerly known as Facebook, Meta, has not wanted for critical attention in recent years. It currently sits in the crosshairs of regulators and lawmakers throughout the global north for a litany of sins: abuse of its quasi-monopolistic power, the promotion of harmful content on its networks, and industrial-scale privacy violations. With somewhat less clamour, Meta has also been condemned by activists, academics and policymakers for its activities in the global south, serving as an accelerant for ethnic violence, election manipulation and its net neutrality busting mobile app Free Basics. Perhaps owing to the finite bandwidth the techlash has available to it in the public consciousness, what has fallen below the radar has been a more recent focus by Meta on the build-out of critical internet infrastructure in the global south. The perceived invisibility of infrastructure may in part account for this illusion, but the material reality of a sharp rise in platform-led internet infrastructure should concern the protagonists of the techlash, given the degree of control that Meta is developing over internet access in the global south. The main focus of this presentation is going to trace the extent of Meta Platform Inc.'s connectivity program in Africa, a multifaceted strategy consisting of subsea cables, fiber backbone, and other terrestrial technologies, as well as its Free Basics app. On a theoretical level, I want to explore the tension that exists between Meta's investments that allow southern states to pursue economic and technological development that could contribute to digital sovereignty, while at the same time ceding control over communication systems in a way that seems to correspond to the thesis of data colonialism. Ultimately, as one of the foremost concentrations of power in our digital age, it's imperative we understand how Meta's infrastructure projects impact the agency and autonomy of millions of citizen users in the global south. I'll start by discussing the scope and nature of Meta's connectivity programs in Africa, and then place it into the context of other platform programs developed by Alphabet and Huawei, as well as earlier connectivity programs undertaken as Facebook. I'll then briefly define the concepts of data colonialism and digital sovereignty, and conclude with a discussion of how Meta's connectivity program corresponds to these seemingly incommensurate ideas. Before proceeding, I should disclose that this presentation really describes the contours of a nascent research project that I'm starting as a postdoc in the GMICP. So this presentation contains a lot more unanswered questions than it does definitive conclusions. First slide, please. Without doubt, the most extensive and ambitious single piece of Meta's infrastructure program is the To Africa submarine cable. Comprised of 37,000 kilometers connecting 33 countries, on completion in 2024, it will be the longest submarine cable in the world. I think if you slide, it'll zoom in on the map, please. With 23 of those landing points in Africa, it's slated to provide nearly 3 times the total current network capacity of all the subsea cables currently serving Africa today. For this project, Meta is partnering with 7 telcos to build its cable in what is known in the industry as a club that includes heavyweights on the African continent, MTN, Vodafone and Orange, as well as China Mobile. Meta has also been developing less iconic but no less significant terrestrial infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. 2 years ago, for instance, Meta invested $20 million in just one Nigerian state to lay fiber optic cables, and last year announced plans to lay 2,000 kilometers of cable across the DRC, creating a so-called digital corridor connecting the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Similar investments have been made in South Africa and Uganda. Of course, Meta are not on their own in seeking to enmesh the African continent into global data networks. Alphabet is wrapping up its own massive subsea cable connecting South Africa to Portugal. Unlike Meta, Alphabet's Equiano cable is wholly owned by the company. Huawei, meanwhile, has made similar investments over the past 5 years as part of the Chinese government's Digital Silk Road policy. These are focused on data centers and cloud services, smart city initiatives, as well as providing equipment for 5G and 4G networks throughout the region. It's important to understand that for Meta, this focus on infrastructure has not emerged out of the ether. It dovetails with the corporation's other major connectivity program, Free Basics. Launched in 2013, it partnered with mobile carriers in each country to offer its voice-only subscribers access to a suite of pared-down web apps, with Facebook, unsurprisingly, the showpiece. It offers access not to the whole internet, but a curated selection of web apps, and the real crux of it is that initially the service is free. Next slide, please. According to research by Toussaint Natias, in 2019, Free Basics was live in 28 African countries, with Facebook claiming presence in 65 worldwide. Precise numbers are hard to determine because Meta doesn't disclose the numbers, but by the end of 2019, it claimed over 100 million subscribers worldwide. Finally, less auspicious initiatives by Meta also suggest the zeal with which Meta is attempting to establish itself on the continent. Wi-Fi Express is just one, in which it partnered with ISPs in 7 African countries to provide free internet access via hotspots, but it was shuttered in February of this year after 5 years of operation. There were some other initiatives as well, but I won't go into those. So how can we try and make sense, slide please, of Meta's connectivity program, and what is at stake? It's instructive to compare the stated goals of Meta with those objectives that can reasonably be inferred. Slide please. So, and next please. So, according to the African E-Connectivity Index by GSMA in 2021, only 28% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa had mobile internet connectivity in 2022, compared to 49% globally. There's therefore a strong case to be made for the economic and socio-cultural advantages of some African regions gaining access to network infrastructure. Many studies have indeed attempted to quantify those advantages, with Meta claiming that Europe, for instance, has enjoyed 18 billion in extra GDP each year since its Maria cable launched in 2019. Meta capitalizes on the perceived relationship between connectivity and development, saying the To Africa cable will ensure, I quote, everyone can benefit from the economic, educational and social advantages of a digitally connected world. Alphabet makes similarly grandiose claims that the purpose of its cable is to interconnect humanity. Indeed, Meta have long cloaked their efforts in the rhetoric of philanthropy, of the Free Basics program famously claiming that connectivity is a human right. To review the names given to the platform cables is to be reminded of the best of humanity, Equiano, named after a famous abolitionist, Peace, Curie, etc. What Meta does not disclose, however, contradicts any claim to philanthropic intent. Next slide, please. So Africa represents one of the last major untapped market for the web platforms, with fast-growing young populations and internet service in most markets that's either expensive and/or weak or non-existent. The potential for expansion is enormous, providing the infrastructure can be built out by actors with deep pockets and no immediate need of ROI. Part of whistleblower Frances Haugen's testimony to the US Senate was that Facebook understood that much of the global north was now saturated, and that, in her words, if they want the company to grow, they have to find new users. There's a clear parallel with purveyors of other harmful products to seek out new users in less developed or regulated international markets, for instance, tobacco and asbestos. The regulatory environment in many parts of Africa, despite a recent flurry of data protection laws, nearly half of Africa's 54 countries have no current privacy rules, is comparatively loose, making those markets akin to a sandbox for Meta, in which they can trial services and possibly evade the unfavorable regulatory attention received in North America and Europe. However, it may have been an event that preceded even Cambridge Analytica that catalyzed Meta's pivot to engineering as the route to user growth. The ejection of Free Basics from India in 2016, the result of a decisive pro-net neutrality ruling from the national telecoms regulator, and a fierce resistance from civil society groups and the local tech sector, was a stinging rebuke for Facebook. It appears the lessons learned were to avoid obvious infringements of net neutrality and to fly below the radar as much as possible. The perceived neutrality of infrastructure certainly helps in this regard. A final imperative is to secure valuable data transmission capacity. According to Telegeography in 2010, content providers consumed 6% of total international cable capacity. By 2021, that number was 69%. When you couple this with the dearth of data centers in Africa, barely 1% of the world's capacity is on the continent, 80,000 square feet. The UK has 500,000 by contrast. Then the need for massive data transmission capacity to reach platform data centers in Europe is near. Moreover, 80% of Africa's international traffic is routed via Europe, with high latency making video calls or games sometimes a frustrating experience. To apply a theoretical lens to these developments, we'll look at now at two sets of ideas, data colonialism and digital sovereignty. Slide, please. No, next, please. And one more. There we go, thank you. So, in the context of a decolonial turn in data studies in particular and academia generally, it's worth focusing on Nick Coldry and Ulysses Mejia's 2019 book as one of the most prominent and most thoroughly developed frameworks. According to those authors, data colonialism represents a new mode of global resource extraction that exists in the service of capitalism but is not reducible to it. Their thesis is that when behavior is datafied and extracted on a systematic basis, it establishes a new set of colonial relationships. Their thesis directs our focus to four important dimensions: the global scope of data colonialism that extends beyond simply social media to encompass data extraction in all fields of social life, that it's not just commodification but also the control engendered through data relations, and to connect current processes of data extraction to the historical trajectory of colonialism. Next slide, please. Sovereignty is, and one more, please. Sovereignty is another term that's enjoying a real moment in the public discourse. Canadian academics Stéphane Couture and Sophie Tupin have done great work analysing the discourses of sovereignty around communication and created a taxonomy of cyber, digital, data, indigenous and social movement sovereignty, all in relation to the collection and storage of data and control of over the infrastructure used to do that. The important thread that runs through all of them is that they refer to collective relational power applied in an oppositional way. So with these sets of ideas in mind, and final slide please, let's now return to meta-connectivity to see how they might help us understand its efforts more clearly. In terms of sovereignty, the possibility that Meta's infrastructure investments will generate significant socio-economic benefits would certainly strengthen the digital sovereignty of many African nations. According to research commissioned by Alphabet, on its Equiano cable, Nigeria, Namibia and South Africa would all see 3 to 5 times internet speed increases, a 15% price drop in retail internet, and a 0.5% of GDP growth. Meta has published similar predictions, but the source of these figures should raise red flags. Another possible argument in favour of sovereignty echoes the laying of the original transoceanic cables, where private corporations played a major role, partly to avoid the involvement of foreign state-owned cables entering into other sovereign territory. Finally, if Meta's claims are to be believed, the bandwidth will be available on a fair and equitable basis, providing local content creators and ISPs access to fat pipes of speed and capacity that dwarf those of current submarine cables. However, this also renders existing cables obsolete, which would cut out a swathe of the existing market, most of which are African-owned. Indeed, in the absence of local data center capacity, much of the data generated in Africa, including government, civic and health, will be sent offshore via infrastructure owned in part by one colossally powerful platform. Will that data therefore be subject to the extractive and predatory practices that correspond to data colonialism? And although To Africa is a consortium, will it always be thus? The opaque nature of the agreement means we don't know if Meta could assert complete control at a later date. Certainly its monopolistic tendencies in other arenas raise concerns it could become a vertically integrated ISP from screen to data center and all points in between. The possibility that Meta could also leverage this power to assert even more control over digital infrastructure, payment systems, the metaverse, etc., could lead to data extraction in greater swathes of social life, again corresponding to this notion of data colonialism. Dependency on a US corporation certainly smacks of neocolonialism, and the abrupt shutdown of express Wi-Fi shows the precarious nature of being reliant upon the largesse of Western tech companies. The manner in which Meta has supported local communities of developers in Ghana and Nigeria, as well as developing partnerships with prominent digital rights organizations, suggests that Meta has learned from its chastening experience in India and is engaged in a colonial mode of identifying and preempting resistance. A fork in the road that leads away from the prospect of meta control and dependency may be coming in terms of the volume of data capacity being built in Africa. In 2010, the Internet Society set a goal of 80% of continental internet traffic to move within Africa's borders, and a decade later, the emergence of IXPs such as NAP Africa meant that while a third of Kenya and Nigeria's traffic was local in 2012, it's now 70%. Calls for data localization have been growing louder in Africa, driven in part by concerns over government and oil and gas data being sent offshore. However, given that a US corporation just acquired a majority stake in the largest data center operator in Africa, and many others are operated by Huawei, Amazon, and Microsoft, data localization could be a Pyrrhic victory. Cory Doctorow described a quote that Cory Doctorow famously used, described free basics as a poor internet for poor people. With the new engineering focus of Meta's connectivity, that prospect may have been eclipsed by a high-speed but zealously policed toll road. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. From where I'm standing, I don't see any questions yet on the interwebs. Are there any questions in the room? Please walk towards the microphone so the people on Zoom can hear you.
Yes, hello. Thank you for a very interesting morning session. I'm Yuka from the Public Interest Advocacy Center, and I actually have two questions, but I'll start with my first, which is directed more for Professor Henten. And it goes to the practical challenges of remedying the bigness of big tech. So with network effects being such an important part of the success, efficiency, and uptake of big tech platforms, how can we break up, or is it even possible to effectively break up these big companies, especially where consumers are so deeply integrated into the platform ecosystem, for example, Google?
Should we take that question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm using the microphone. Can you hear what I say? Yeah, but I mean, this, first of all, I'd like to say that this is a development taking place that you want to regulate sort of the big tech and platforms. This is a new development all over the world, right? Because for many, many years, the claim has been that if you intervene in these operations, you risk to do more harm than you do good. But during the past 5 years or so in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere, there have been many initiatives starting to regulate this. And this goes both on sort of on the economic regulation of them and also the social aspects, because, I mean, if you look at Europe, in a sense, this is illustrative because there you have an upcoming DMA, Digital Markets Act, which is basically an economic kind of regulation and regulating the markets, the economic aspects, and a DSA, which is a combination in reality of social regulation and also economic regulation. And some people would say, this is all too late. We should have done it before, right? And there is always a paradox in this because if you regulate maybe too early, then you risk that you sort of kill something which is just upcoming. But then suddenly when they have, as you say, a very large subscribership and followers and so on, then it is very difficult actually to regulate it more deeply. And I think that these initiatives are maybe coming a little late, but at least they are coming up now. And as I said, there are both these social aspects of it and the economic aspects. And in Europe, at least, the idea is basically to regulate both, one could say, the market for platforms, but also the market for companies using the platform. So it's very much to do with what I was talking about, the scope of these companies, that they have a lot of different companies relying on their businesses, right? So this needs to be regulated, because otherwise the risk is that there's preference for their own associates and their own companies as opposed to other companies. But I mean, it's a huge work, and I think that many people would say that this is too little and too late. But nevertheless, I see that there are many initiatives around the world, and I see that as a very positive sign. I don't know whether that answers your question, but at least.
Thank you. Just a reminder for the people on Zoom, I'm keeping an eye on Zoom, on the Q&A tool. So if you have any questions, put it there. I saw another hand in the audience. Please move towards the microphone. Feel free to state your name and who you want to direct your question to.
Sure. Thanks for the panel. Again, Anas, I'm sorry. It's addressing you again. You are claiming for a more prominent role of the demand side. And I have a question which concerns all of us, maybe, and this is methodology. I mean, one of the reasons why we look at the supply side normally is that we have access to data, because we can observe what the supply is, we can do content analysis, we can watch whatever is on the platforms. But on the demand side, it's much more complicated and difficult, because we do not have access to demand data from platforms. And if we have, it's data from the companies. So it's the data the companies are willing to share with us. And we have no idea whether these are reliable, whether these data are complete. So in an empirical way, how can we deal with that? So how can we as researchers, how can we in the academic world get the correct data and the reliable data from the platforms? This is a major question for all of us, I think, and demand-side research requires solid data.
Can I build?
Sure, do that.
I want to build on Joseph's question, because it's one of the several questions that I have. And so this access to data is a really, really important one. And Argelia finished up her presentation with a call for regulation of online video services, not so much as a way of regulating them just like traditional broadcasters, but rather as a means of gaining access to data. Then we heard from Terry and from Cam about some of the experience with the News Media Bargaining Code kind of a year on. And one of the things that struck me in their presentation was that a year on, and we don't really have much data about who's getting what out of the new News Media Bargaining Code, the distribution of revenue. I think that, you know, the overall quantum is known, but in fact how it's actually being kind of, who's getting what isn't known. So across the boards, and I think we have some questions coming up from Guy here as well in his paper, and then, you know, I've got other questions for Guy and for Adrian. So let's just, those questions about information access that Joseph started with, is there some way of maybe getting a joint response and a conversation amongst our panelists around this question? Disclosure obligations, regulated mandatory information disclosure obligations, and then access to data for researchers and others. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. And then I have other questions, but I'll leave those in case there's a vacuum.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is make sure this doesn't become too chaotic. Is there anybody on Zoom who wants to take that on first? Maybe raise your hand. I can see all of you on Zoom, on the panel. So is there one of you? Yeah, Cam, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how well I'm going to be able to answer this question, but certainly in terms of gaining access to data, it does seem like that Google or Alphabet with YouTube and Twitter actually are kind of coming to the party, providing a certain amount of actually demand side data available. And Meta has for a while using CrowdTangle made that data available. But I do to some degree agree with the concern about how to, do we just trust the data coming from these platforms? I think you can. But it's probably up to someone to do something really empirical to really test that. But one thing to consider as well is that user engagement isn't the complete picture either. It's the people kind of talking and behaving loudest online that engage. I remember seeing some number a couple of years ago about Reddit, and that actually only a very small portion of people on Reddit are actually contributing in any capacity whatsoever, and the rest are kind of lurkers. So the current social metrics that we have available to us don't really give us a complete picture. And it kind of just reminded me of the black box that Dwayne was actually talking about yesterday, about trying to how do we crack this open. And I wonder if we have to accept that we have a bit of a vague kind of future ahead of us when it comes to trying to understand things like demand side data, but also trying to understand the actual revenue that these media companies are making and where it's coming from too. I think, yeah, maybe accepting vagary a little bit might be a part of it, but there are options available to us if we do want demand side data.
Yeah, Terry,
I was just going to add the point that the difficulties with getting reliable demand side information in media industries are nothing new. Commercial ratings have always been a crude proxy for measurement of audience, let alone understanding of audience. And I think perhaps something I would note is that in Australia, it's been the news media aspects of the ACCC's work that have attracted the most attention. But there's been a very significant set of parallel inquiries going on into ad tech. And why those are significant is, and the advertisers may turn out to be the friends of the researchers in this regard, because their issue in the ad tech inquiry is precisely, well, not precisely, but a very similar issue to the one that we're raising here. How can we verify the veracity of the data that's being provided to us by people who basically control all stages of the value chain? So I think I'd suggest to watch that space in the respect that it may well be advertisers who will be pushing. Will be the push coming from advertisers for better access or independent access. So I think I would qualify, or I'd distinguish the question of the accuracy of the data and the independence of the data. That if you look at the history of television ratings, it's been the idea that there are third parties that gather that ratings data, which has been critical. Whether or not it's accurate is open to a range of questions. So I think in that respect, Dwayne and Joseph, to pick up on your point, I think I'd be watching trends in ad tech, advertising spend, and what the advertising industry is demanding from platforms to get some sense of how the knotty issues around demand side data may start to be addressed.
Great, thank you. Are there, Anders, you want to?
No, but now that it was a direct question from Joseph, I mean, I think at first I'd like to challenge how easy it is to get information data on the supply side, right? We have great difficulties in actually knowing I mean, companies are often very not willing to give out information about this and that. So I'd like to challenge the bits that it's easier to get information on the supply side. And you, as being a media researcher, will also know that for many years, audience research on the demand side, so to say, has been a really strong trend in media research, maybe stronger than looking into the corporations themselves. So I'd like to challenge that a bit, actually. But what I wanted to do was basically with this intervention to attract attention to the fact, or to the interest in the scope side of companies, and also what is demand driven. And if you for instance read the impact assessment of the Digital Markets Act in the EU, which is a comprehensive document, a very good document, discussing also scope aspect. But what is characteristic is that when they sort of sum up what is important, the scope side sort of seems to disappear in the analysis, and therefore it's important that we sort of attract the attention to the scope aspects of companies also, and also the aspects which are driven by the, I mean, we have heard the words now, data is the oil of the new industries and the wealth and so on. And I agree with these statements in a sense, and they point to the fact that the demand side is extremely important in building the wealth of these companies.
Okay, thank you. There is a question on Zoom.
I just want to know if Argelia had a comment to respond there too, but I'm maybe out of line here.
So, what's the last part?
I was just wondering if Argelia, Dr. Muñoz had a point that she might want to make with respect to that regulated information disclosure point, but I'll sit down.
Okay, yeah. Well, not, I mean, I don't have this topic particularly researched yet. In terms of regulation and transparency. But what I know is that all the other traditional windows were obliged or voluntarily will share that data, right? So we have the attendance numbers in cinema, and we have also the ratings on TV. And I think that the fact that the streaming platforms are using also the public national infrastructure in Mexico could be also kind of a way to justify them complying with some obligations, as you said, in terms of transparency. But that will be all.
Perfect, thank you. So this is a question from Zoom to Guy. Tahira Dawood from the Public Interest Advocacy Center. And the question is, what steps has Meta taken to address issues of net neutrality with its Free Basics project in Africa? So what has Meta done in terms of net neutrality with Free Basics?
Yes, so I mean, one tactic has been to withdraw from those markets in which net neutrality is properly enforced, as in the case of India. And what else they've done in response to criticisms around net neutrality has either been to operate in those markets where net neutrality isn't a regulatory concern. And also what they've done is they loosened the curation of the web apps to include more local content and more services that could be considered broadly kind of commercial competitors to Facebook, to lessen the sense that it was a violation of net neutrality in favor of the use of Facebook.
Perfect. I'm very aware that we're perfectly at time. There's last but not least, we'll have a final question. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I have a question to Guy, but maybe all the speakers can give their point of view. Guy, it's more evident maybe when we are talking about infrastructures and the materiality of the digital industries. But my question is about sovereignty. And the role and the process by which a company like Meta achieves to develop such a program you have presented. And what is the position of the governments? Are they on demand of such initiatives? Is it a pure private initiative? Are there agreements or contracts made between Meta and governments? Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I certainly don't have all the answers. As I said, I'm just beginning to kind of explore this topic. I think that's a really fundamental aspect of this that I need to explore further, and indeed we all need to have a clearer understanding of. I mean, certainly in terms of the interoceanic cables, that those can be laid without government approval or intervention, and then at landing points and the terrestrial projects, though many of those will be, certainly in the case of the Nigerian state terrestrial backbone cable that I mentioned, that was done in partnership with local government in Nigeria. So it depends on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, certainly in the context of understanding this through the lens of digital sovereignty, it is really important to have a sense of how, to what extent, local government and by extension, the local population has been, been able to hold Meta and similar companies to account.
I don't want put anybody on the spot, but I'm still going to do it. Adrian, can I give you the last word? Because I'm so curious about your perspective. You have such a different case in a way. So you have the last word. You can take a pass on this question of sovereignty, data.
On the question of sovereignty, well, yeah. I think one of the kind of key things that this paper emerges from a broad kind of discussion that came out of work I did on digital emporiums in India and the ways in which the license or the charter that's effectively been given to Reliance is, so similar to the charter that was once given to the East India Company across all sectors to create basically its own sovereign market. And that's the kind of price of keeping out free basics, is to create a domestic free basics, that's incredibly concentrated and kind of entrenches a monopoly interest in the infrastructure as well as the shop front of the digital economy in India. So, if I was Mukesh Ambani, I want to support national sovereignty and data sovereignty, because who's going to build those data centers? Who's going to supply the electricity to keep data from 1 billion people cool, in the subtropics, if it isn't going to be the biggest power generating and oil refining company in the country? That pays for all the media interests. So you can give away free data to everyone. And it's paid for by the underlying infrastructure business, which is such a common feature of the platform economy when you look into it, in those links between where the money's actually made, not just the kind of walled garden at the app front. So I think that there are those kind of questions around sovereignty and how it's invoked. And in the Indian case, it's about having the heft and the history of making an intervention to create national champions, which of course many African countries don't have. Or the Philippines or Vietnam, where free basics is basically the internet for 95% of the population. That's already a fact. But the question over whether these domestic players are not engaged in a certain form of colonialism themselves, I think is another kind of question that we need to consider.
Great, thank you so much. I'll leave it at that. Let's give everybody, including yourself, a round of applause. And see you after the break.